Okay, I'm back. I hope you enjoyed the first section of the novel. The second section, we pick up with Isabel. It takes place just outside of Havana, Cuba in 1994. Really quick, Cuba is one of the smaller islands in the Caribbean. And we'll learn more about Cuba. I'm going to post some links in the resources streams for each of you so that you can do a little bit of background research on each of these different locations and get a better understanding as to why each of these families have decided to seek refuge in other places. It only took 2 tries to get the scrawny calico kitten to come out from under the pink cinderblock house and eat from Isabel Fernandez's hand. The cat was hungry, just like everyone else in Cuba, and its belly quickly won over its fear. The cat was so tiny that it could only nibble at the beans. Its tummy purred like an outboard motor, and it butted its head against Isabel's hand in between bites. "You're not much to look at, are you, kitty?" Isabel said. Its fur was scraggly and dull, and Isabel could feel the cat's bones through its skin. The kitten wasn't too different from her, Isabel realized. Thin, hungry, and in need of a bath. Isabel was 11 years old, and all lanky arms and legs. Her brown face was splotchy with freckles, and her thick brown hair was cut short for summer and pulled back behind her ears. She was barefoot like always and wore a tank top and shorts. The kitten gobbled up the last of the beans and mewed pitifully. Isabel wished she had something else to give it, but this food was already more than she could spare. Her lunch hadn't been much bigger than the cat's, just a few beans and a small pile of white rice. There had been rationing and food coupon books back when Isabel was little. But a few years ago, in 1989, the Soviet Union had fallen and Cuba had hit rock bottom. Cuba was a communist country like Russia had been. And for decades, the Soviets had been buying Cuba's sugar for 11 times the price and sending the little island food and gasoline and medicine for free. But when the Soviet Union went away, so did all of their support. Most of the farms in Cuba grew only sugarcane. With no one to overpay for it, the cane fields dried up, and the sugar refineries closed, and people lost their jobs. Without Russia's gas, they couldn't run the tractors to change the fields over to food. And without the extra food, the Cuban people began to starve. All the cows and pigs and sheep had been slaughtered and eaten. People had even broken into the Havana Zoo and eaten the animals. And cats, like this little kitten, had ended up on dinner tables. But nobody was going to eat this cat. "You'll just be our little secret," Isabel whispered. "Hey, Isabel!" Ivan said, making her jump. The cat skittered away underneath the house. Ivan was a year older than Isabel and lived next door. He and Isabel had been friends as long as she could remember. Ivan was lighter skinned than Isabel, with curly dark hair. He wore sandals, shorts, and even a short-sleeved brown button-down shirt, and a cap with the fancy letter I on it, the logo of the Havana baseball team, the Industriales. He wanted to be a professional baseball player when he grew up, and he was good enough that it wasn't a crazy dream. Ivan plopped into the dusty ground beside Isabel. "Look, I found a bit of a dead fish on the beach for the cat." Ivan plopped into the dusty ground beside Isabel. Oh, sorry, I already read that part. Isabel recoiled at the smell, but the kitten came running back, eating greedily from Ivan's hand. "She needs a name," Ivan said. Ivan gave names to everything. The stray dogs who wandered the town, his bicycle, and even his baseball glove. "How about Jorge or Javier, or Lazaro. Those are all boys' names, Isabel said. Yes, but they are all players for the Lions, and she's a little lion. The Lions was the nickname of the industrialis. Ivan, his father called from next door. I need your help in the shed. Ivan climbed to his feet. I have to go. We're building a doghouse, he said before sprinting away. Isabel shook her head. Ivan thought that he was being sneaky, but Isabel knew exactly what he and his father were building in their shed, and it wasn't a doghouse. It was a boat to sail to the United States. Isabel was worried that the Castillos were going to get caught. Fidel Castro, the man who ruled Cuba as president and prime minister, wouldn't allow anyone to leave the country, especially not to go to the United States. El Norte, as the Cubans called it, the North. If you were caught trying to leave for El Norte by boat, Castro would throw you in jail. Isabel knew that because her own father had tried and been thrown in jail for a year. Isabel noticed her father and grandfather heading down the road toward the city to stand in line for food. She put the little kitten back under the house and ran inside for her trumpet. Isabel loved tagging along on trips into Havana to stand on a street corner and play her trumpet for pesos. She never did make much, not because she wasn't good. As her mother liked to say, Isabel could play the storm clouds from the sky. People often stopped and listened to her and clapped and tapped their feet. But the only people who could afford to give her pesos were tourists, visitors from Canada or Europe or Mexico. Ever since the Soviet Union had collapsed, the only currency most Cubans had were the booklets you got stamped when you went to pick up your food rations from the store. A food ration book and food ration books were pretty worthless anyway. There wasn't enough food to go around, whether you had a booklet or not. Isabel caught up to her father and grandfather and then parted ways with them on Malecon, the broad road that curved along the seawall of Havana Harbor. On one side of the road were blocks of green and yellow and pink and baby blue homes and shops. The paint peeling and the buildings were old and weathered, but they still looked grand to Isabel. She stood on the side of the promenade where it seemed all of Havana was on display. Mothers carried their babies in slings. Couples kissed under the palm trees. Buskers played rumbas on guitars and drums. Boys took their turns diving into the sea. Tourists took pictures. It was Isabel's favorite place in the whole city. Isabel tossed an old ball cap on the ground on an off chance that one of the tourists actually had a peso to spare. She lifted the trumpet to her lips. As she blew, her fingers tapped out the notes that she knew by heart. It was a salsa tune that she liked to play. But this time she listened past the music, past the noise of the cars and trucks on Malecon, past the people talking as they walked by, past the crash of waves against the seawall behind her. Isabel was listening for the clave. Underneath the music, the mysterious hidden beat inside Cuban music that everybody seemed to hear except for her. It was an irregular rhythm that lay over the top of the regular beat, like a heartbeat beneath the skin. Try as she might, she never heard it, never felt it. She listened now intently, trying to hear the heartbeat of Cuba in her own music. What she heard instead was the sound of breaking glass. Couple of notes. You heard some very direct and indirect characterization of Isabel and even the cat that was in this section, this chapter. Really quick, as a reminder, especially for sixth graders, direct characterization is when the author directly tells us descriptive characteristics about our characters. Indirect is when they don't outright tell us, they let us infer them. So a couple of things about Isabel about her character that they didn't have to actually tell us. Fidel Castro is no longer the director or leader, president of Cuba. But for many years, he had taken power and was in charge and had very strict laws and rules. Hint, hint, you probably can connect that back to Joseph's story with Hitler. I even put the note that Fidel Castro could be classified as a dictator, and we'll talk more about that later. For many years, Cubans have made makeshift boats and rafts and sailed to Florida from their little island in seek of refuge on America's soil. Still happens today, not as frequently, but it has been going on since as long as I've ever known, where you will find boats that wash ashore with refugees. A couple other things I pointed out: a promenade where she stood near to play her trumpet is kind of like a walkway where everyone went. So if you've ever gone out to maybe Grand Haven and walked kind of like the pier or like the major sidewalk in through town, that would be considered a promenade. That's the best connection that I could make to that. And then buskers are kind of like what Isabel's doing right now. They put out a hat or they put out a container as a way to collect money, and they either play instruments or they perform, they sing, they dance, we don't see this so much in Grand Rapids, but if you travel to any of the major cities, if you've ever been to Chicago, New York, not that many of you have been to New York, but Washington, D.C., any major cities, it's pretty common to see buskers, and their main target are tourists. They perform, and tourists give them money as a source of income. So that's what a busker is. And then the clave. We'll talk more about that too. I'm going to put a link about the clave, which is kind of an underlying beat. If you didn't hear, my cats are very interested in this story, just like you guys are. So if you hear them in the background, I'm sorry. It's just them telling me about what they think of the story too. All right, see you in the next video.